I've mentioned that discerning economic development dynamics in the context of colonial power dynamics can be challenging, not least because the development objectives of the colonizing power naturally conflict with those of an undeveloped economy striving for self-sufficiency. The colonizing and industrializing European nations formed a core, and the rest of the world was the periphery. Natural development processes in periphery countries were often thwarted in favor of unsustainable structures and arrangements that favored the core, through both direct and indirect imperialism. Japan provides an interesting case study in this regard, as it is the only periphery nation to industrialize purely on its own terms, with such success that it grew to rival the core nations. Let's see how it accomplished this generally, and then we'll look at some specific developmental details. The story begins in the 1600s, when the Tokugawa shogunate observed the Spanish takeover of the Philippines and wanted to avoid a similar fate. Japan knew it wasn't able to resist the technological, military, and cultural power of the Europeans, so it shut down access to the country except for an enclave off Nagasaki known as Dejima. Dejima was an artificial island created in 1636 by cutting a canal through a peninsula, and the only access to Japan proper from Dejima was a single bridge across this canal. Any foreigner found outside this enclave was executed, and Japanese returning from abroad were also executed. Yet through Dejima, Japan conducted a vigorous import and export trade with the rest of the world, primarily through the Dutch. This became known as the Edo period. By the 1800s, Japan was a highly literate and urban nation, and these qualities laid the groundwork for the technical competence to support a concerted reverse engineering effort to reproduce those imports, beginning with cannon foundries. Around this time, a group of families secretly sent their sons out into the wide world to learn about European and American technology and institutions. In 1853, American warships entered Tokyo Bay and demanded access to Japanese ports. The Japanese took this as a sign that it was time for them to enter the world, but they still wanted to do it in a way that preserved their values, culture, and agency. In 1868, the Tokugawa dynasty was replaced by the Meiji, and the Meiji Restoration began, with the goal of Weikan Yosai, Western learning with Japanese spirit. The restoration was initially headed by the Meiji Six, one of whom, Ito Hirobumi, was one of those wandering sons who spent time in England and studying finance and banking in the United States. Japan also had a group of wealthy merchant families with names like Mitsui, Sumitomo, and Mitsubishi, willing and able to devote their resources toward industrialization. Thus began the rapid adoption of selected Western institutions such as language standardization, newspapers, railways, national taxation, and the Gregorian calendar. Mills, streetlights, shipyards, and telegraphs were all reverse engineered, and the Imperial College of Engineering was founded. By the early 1900s, Japan had engaged in military conflict with both China and Russia and had won, and thereafter was able to participate in the world market more or less on equal terms with nations of the core. Recall that aspects of the Toyota production system are still in use at production facilities around the world to this day. I'll end this story with a couple of vignettes of Japanese development that are indicative of natural development processes. Japanese cities began modern industrialization in the mid-19th century, and much of the population was urban. Japanese farmers could not produce enough rice to feed this urban population, and a quarter of rice consumption came from imports. Then the Japanese farmers began to absorb and utilize industrial goods and knowledge obtained through the activities of the cities. By 1960, though Japan's population had grown by 25%, farmers could meet all domestic rice demand as well as provide a diversity of other foods. The Japanese could at first not compete with American manufacturing of such things as bicycles, but they built up their own bicycle manufacturing industry organically by setting up repair shops to work on the imported bicycles. Repair shops began making the replacement parts themselves rather than relying on imported parts, becoming light manufacturers, with different shops specializing in different parts. Next, people could obtain parts from the various shops to assemble domestically manufactured bicycles. This natural method of developing a domestic bicycle industry did not require any large-scale costly investment, and the light manufacturing experience has broad multiplier effects across many industries. This line of development describes many such import substitution products, such as sewing machines and consumer electronics, both of which Japan was the leading producer by 1970.